a young mother working double shifts at a rundown Chicago diner, had exactly $2 left to her name while her 6-year-old daughter lay in a hospital bed waiting for a $65,000 heart surgery with only 3 days before the surgical window closed forever. Her manager Derek Collins stole her tips every night, forced her into unpaid overtime, and threatened to fire her if she ever reported his harassment. She was trapped in a cycle of poverty and silence, watching her child slip away while the man who controlled her paycheck destroyed her $1 at a time. November rain hammered the Chicago streets at 3:47 in the morning. Neon diner signs bled red and blue across wet asphalt, turning the rain into broken reflections of light that looked like crying. The alley behind Murphy's diner smelled of garbage and rust and something darker underneath, the smell of violence about to happen. Aria Bennett stood with her arms spread wide between Derek Collins and 2 men in leather jackets. She was 28 years old but looked decades older. Her green diner apron was stained with coffee and grease. Her orthopedic shoes had holes in both heels, worn through from standing 14 hours a day on concrete floors. Her hair, once auburn, had dulled to the color of old copper. But her eyes were still burning. Derek Collins pressed a steel pipe against the palm of his hand. He was 42, with the soft body of a man who took what he wanted without ever doing the work himself. The homeless man behind him whimpered, pinned against the brick wall, his cardboard sign torn and worthless on the wet ground. Rain soaked through Aria's clothes. Her pocket held $2 in coins, for quarters, for dimes, 8 nickels. She had counted them 3 times that shift, hoping somehow the total would change. It never did. Derek laughed. The sound of it was like gravel in a disposal. "You should go back inside, Aria. This doesn't concern you." "Leave him alone," she said. Her hand shook but her voice did not. The homeless man looked at her with the confused expression of someone watching a person volunteer to drown so someone else might breathe. Derek took a step closer. The 2 men with him exchanged a look. They had worked for Derek for years in his small kingdom of minimum wage workers and stolen tips. They had never seen anyone stand against him. They did not understand what they were about to witness. But what she did not know was that from the shadows near the loading dock, a man in a wheelchair watched every second. His name was Salvatore Marino. The most feared name in Chicago's underworld. A paraplegic mafia boss who had been abandoned at his own wedding altar 7 years ago when his bride saw him and the wheelchair together and decided that marrying a crippled man was not the future she had chosen. He had come to this alley by chance, following a lead on one of his operations, and instead he found this. Salvatore was 6'1" in the wheelchair, broad-shouldered, with dark hair silvered at the temples and a scar running from his left eye to his cheekbone like a blade had once tried to cut him in half. He wore a cashmere coat worth more than everything Aria owned. His hands were covered in silver rings, each one signifying a different part of his empire. He did not move. He simply watched. And in that moment, watching this broken waitress stand against armed men without hesitation, something in Salvatore's chest shifted. He saw in her the same defiant love he had once possessed, the love that could not save his daughter when she was born not breathing, the love that was supposed to matter but did not matter at all to a universe that took things away without asking permission. Footsteps approached from inside the diner. Heavy footsteps. Male voices, laughing, the sound of the late-night kitchen crew heading out back for a smoke break. Derek heard them. He lowered the steel pipe. He straightened his jacket. "Go back inside, Aria. And when you come in, you're docked 2 hours pay for stepping outside without permission. Tell anyone about this and you're fired. Tell the police and I'll make sure you never work in this city again." The loading dock door opened. 3 men in white kitchen coats emerged, cigarettes already lit, steam rising from their fingers into the cold air. They did not see the wheelchair in the shadows. They did not see Salvatore Marino watching like a general surveying a battlefield. They did not see the homeless man scrambling to his feet and running into the rain. Aria looked at Derek. She looked at the men with him. She looked at her $2 and the 3 days remaining on her daughter's surgical window. Then she walked back inside. Before we continue, drop a like if this story hits you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming tomorrow. Now let us go back to the beginning to understand how Aria Bennett ended up with nothing but $2 and 3 days to save her daughter's life. 3 days earlier. The morning light was grey and thin as paper. Aria's alarm went off at 5 in the morning. The sound of it was sharp and terrible in the darkness of her small studio apartment in a part of Chicago where the streetlights had been broken for years. She did not jolt awake. She opened her eyes the way a person opens their eyes when they have not truly slept. When sleep is something that happens to other people. She lay still for 2 minutes. The ceiling above her bed had a water stain shaped like a question mark. She had named it years ago. She called it the question mark because it asks if things will ever change. Then she got up. Her feet touched the cold floor. Her toenails were painted blue. Emma had done it 2 weeks ago before the diagnosis. Emma had taken her mother's hand and painted each nail carefully while sitting on the hospital waiting room floor. It was the last day they had pretended everything was normal. Aria put on her work uniform. The green diner dress that had been washed so many times it felt like tissue paper. The apron with 3 stains that would never come out no matter how hard she scrubbed. She tied her hair back with a rubber band that had lost its elasticity. She put on the orthopedic shoes. She sat on the edge of her bed and counted the money in her wallet. $43.17. She had written it down in a notebook 3 days ago. She subtracted rent, subtracted utilities, subtracted the money she had already sent to the hospital for Emma's pre-surgical tests. $43.17 minus $40 for rent paid to her landlord left her with $3.17. But the hospital had called yesterday. They needed a deposit of $100 to hold the surgical slot. Without it, the window would close. Emma would go to the back of the list. There might not be another surgical window for 6 months. The doctor's words kept repeating in her mind. The heart valve. The deterioration. The 3-month timeline. After 3 months, surgery would be too late. Aria put the money back in her wallet. She put on her jacket. It was the same jacket she had worn for 4 years. The zipper was broken. She kept it together with a safety pin. The walk to Murphy's diner took 20 minutes. November wind cut through her broken jacket like a blade wrapped in ice. Chicago in November was not a place that showed mercy to people with nothing. The streets were hard. The buildings were hard. The sky was the color of something dying. Murphy's diner sat on the corner of Halsted and Division. The neon sign read Murphy's in red letters that flickered like a heartbeat that was failing. The windows were yellow from years of cooking grease. Inside, the black and white checkered floor was sticky underfoot. The hum of the aging refrigerator behind the counter sounded like something mechanical slowly giving up on life. Derek Collins was already there. He was 30 feet tall when he stood up, though he sat hunched in the office chair like a vulture that had found a perch. He had thinning blonde hair and small eyes that never quite looked directly at anyone. His fingernails were clean. He always made sure his fingernails were clean before he touched other people's money. "You're 3 minutes late," he said when he saw Aria. "That comes out of your first table's tips." "I was not," Aria said quietly. "I say you were. You want to argue about it? I can fire you right now. Tell you what, argue with me one more time and I will fire you and make sure every restaurant in this city knows you're a troublemaker. No one will hire you. No other income. Your daughter gets no surgery. How does that sound?" Aria said nothing. She tied her apron tighter around her waist. The apron had been white once. Now it was the color of every shift she had worked for 3 years. Every spill, every burn, every moment of humiliation had left its stain. Derek opened the cash register. He pulled out a handful of bills. He counted them slowly, deliberately, letting Aria watch as money that she had earned moved from the register to his pocket. "Tips from the midnight shift," he said. "That's mine now. New policy. Tips are part of operating costs. I'm keeping them. You want to report me to the owner? Go ahead. The owner is my cousin. You want to report me to the state? The state doesn't care about a waitress making minimum wage plus $2 a night. The rain outside began then. Gentle at first, then harder. It hit the diner windows like something trying to get in, or trying to prevent escape. Aria was not sure which. By 7 o'clock in the morning, the diner was full of construction workers and taxi drivers and old men who had nowhere else to go. The smell of eggs and bacon filled every inch of air. The coffee pot was always full. The tips were always small, quarters, occasionally a dollar bill, once a week a $2 bill that someone had found in their pocket by accident. Aria worked. She did not think. Thinking was a luxury. She moved between tables with an efficiency born of exhaustion. She poured coffee. She wrote down orders with a pencil that was worn to half its original length. She carried plates that were almost too hot to touch. She smiled at men who did not see her. She listened to women complain about their lives while knowing that their complaints were luxury items she could not afford. At 9 o'clock, Derek pulled her aside into the kitchen. The hospital called, he said. They said you didn't pick up when they called yesterday. They said your daughter's pre-surgical appointment is in 2 days. They also said they haven't received the surgical deposit yet. Aria felt her chest tighten. The feeling was familiar. It was the same feeling she had experienced every day for the past month. I'm collecting the money, she said. I'll have it. No, you won't, Derek said. You'll have maybe $500 by the time the window closes. You need $65,000. That's an impossible number. You know what? I'm doing you a favor by not hiring someone else in your place. You're distracted. You're slow. You're barely here. But I like you, Aria. So I'm giving you a chance. Double shifts this week. 6 in the morning to midnight. 7 days straight. I'll pay you minimum wage. Maybe if you work hard enough, you'll scrape together an extra $200. That's real progress. Aria did not argue. Arguing was the luxury that people with options possessed. By 3 in the morning, when her shift finally ended, she had worked 17 hours. Her feet ached in a way that made her wonder if pain could develop a permanent home in bone. Her back felt like someone had been using it as a test subject for a new kind of torture. Her hands were wrinkled from being wet, and burned from hot water, and covered in small cuts from dishes and burns. Derek handed her a check. Minimum wage for 17 hours. After taxes, it would be approximately $137. Minus the money he had already stolen from her tips. Minus the 2 hours he had docked her for stepping outside. Her actual earnings for 17 hours of work were closer to $93. She walked home in the rain. Her apartment was empty. Emma was still in the hospital. The doctors kept her there for observation, for tests, for the slow accumulation of medical data that would determine whether her heart could be saved. Aria sat on her bed. She opened her wallet. She took out every coin she had. She counted them again. $2.34. In 3 days, if she worked double shifts every single day, she might have enough to add to her savings account. She might have approximately $300. The hospital needed $65,000. The gap between what she had and what she needed was so large that it erased the possibility of hope. She thought of Emma in her hospital bed. She thought of the doctor's words. She thought of the surgical window. She thought of the 3 days. Then she heard the sound of rain against her window, and she lay down on her bed, still in her work clothes, and closed her eyes. She did not sleep. She simply waited for morning to come so she could work again. Tomorrow, she would return to the diner. Tomorrow, Derek would steal from her tips. Tomorrow, she would pour coffee for people who would not see her. Tomorrow, the hospital would call again. And she would be 3 days closer to losing her daughter forever. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, she had $2.34 to her name. And in 3 days, everything would change. The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital hummed their endless, colorless song at 6:15 in the morning. The hallway was empty except for the soft footsteps of night shift nurses retreating toward the end of their long darkness. Aria Bennett stood in the doorway of room 412, watching her daughter sleep. Emma was 6 years old, but illness had stolen something from her that children should never lose. Her small frame lay still beneath a hospital blanket the color of old cream. The monitors beside her bed painted their electronic story in green and yellow lines. Her lips held a faint blue tint, the kind of blue that belonged to winter skies, not to the mouths of children. The congenital valve defect in her heart was stealing the oxygen from her blood, making her body work twice as hard to do what other children's bodies did without thought. Aria reached down and brushed a strand of dark hair from her daughter's forehead. The touch was gentle, careful, as if too much pressure might break what was already breaking. She did not wake her. Instead, Aria simply stood there, breathing in the smell of antiseptic and the particular coldness of medical equipment, and held the image of her sleeping child like a prayer. A voice came from behind her, professional and tired. "Mrs. Bennett." Aria turned. Dr. James Martinez stood in the hallway, a man in his early 50s with silver threading through his black hair and the particular exhaustion that belonged only to cardiologists. He held a tablet against his chest like a shield. "Come with me for a moment," he said. They walked 12 feet down the hallway to a small consultation room. The fluorescent light seemed even harsher here. A table. 4 chairs. A window looking out onto the Chicago skyline where the sun was just beginning to bleed orange across the horizon. "Sit," he said. She sat. "The valve damage is progressing faster than we initially anticipated," he said. His voice was careful, measured, each word placed with the precision of someone who had delivered devastating news thousands of times before. "The window for surgery is closing. We can hold the slot for 3 more days. Maybe 4, if the damage stabilizes. After that, the valve will deteriorate to the point where repair becomes impossible. At that stage, we're looking at transplant territory, and there are no hearts available. There are never hearts available for 6-year-old girls." The words entered her ears but did not quite connect to meaning. "The surgery cost $65,000, he continued. "The hospital can work with you on a payment plan, but the surgical slot, that requires a deposit. $10,000 to secure it." Aria's hands were folded in her lap. She looked down at them as if they belonged to someone else. "I don't have $10,000, she said. Her voice was barely a whisper, like wind moving through an empty house. "I understand," he said. He was kind, this doctor. That made it worse. Cruelty would have been easier to bear than kindness. "Talk to the billing department. They've seen situations like this before. They know how to navigate it." He was lying. Not intentionally. But he did not know what it meant to have $2.34 to her name. He did not know what it meant to work 17 hours for $93. He did not know that the gap between what she had and what she needed was so vast that it erased the possibility of anything but loss. Aria nodded. She stood up. She walked back to room 412 and sat in the plastic chair beside Emma's bed and watched the monitors count the irregular beats of her daughter's failing heart. At 7:02 in the morning, she left the hospital. The rain had stopped, but the streets of Chicago remained wet and dark, as if the city itself had not yet woken from a nightmare. Murphy's Diner sat on the corner of 7th and Ashland, a relic of 1987 with black and white checkered tile floors and neon signs that buzzed with the sound of dying electricity. Aria pushed through the front door at 6:57 a.m., 14 minutes early, the way she had been trained to do by Derek Collins, the manager, who believed that lateness was a personal betrayal. Derek was 42 years old and carried his failures like extra weight around his middle. His hair was thinning at the crown, a fact he tried to disguise with a gold watch worn on a wrist that smelled perpetually of whiskey and cheap cologne. He sat at the counter with a coffee and the morning newspaper, pretending to read sports scores but actually watching the door, always watching the door, waiting for someone to give him a reason to exercise the small, mean power he wielded over his employees. "You're on Section 3 today," he said without looking up. "Lunch rush hits at noon. I want every table turned before 1 o'clock. You miss those numbers, I'm cutting your hours." "I'll make the numbers," Aria said. She tied her apron around her waist. The apron was tan with a coffee stain shaped like a country she did not recognize. She had worn this apron for 3 years. It was the most permanent thing in her life besides Emma. The breakfast rush came at 7:30, construction workers and nurses coming off night shift, elderly men who came every single morning for eggs and black coffee and the familiar shape of routine. Aria poured coffee. She wiped tables. She smiled at faces that did not quite see her. To them, she was a function. She existed to deliver food and clear plates and fade into the background like the hum of the air conditioning. By 11:22 a.m., her feet were beginning to swell inside her orthopedic shoes. The heels were worn through at the heel, the leather cracking in patterns like a dried riverbed. She had bought these shoes 2 years ago and they had been too small even then. At 12 o'clock, the lunch rush arrived like a wave. Tables filled in rapid succession. Aria moved between them like a ghost, like a shadow that refused to leave, quiet and present and invisible. She took orders. She delivered food. She refilled water glasses before they were empty. At 12:16 p.m., a businessman in a suit that cost more than her monthly rent left $5 on a $40 tab. A mother with 2 children left $3. An elderly woman left $2 and a penny, and Aria watched her place it carefully on the table, watched her count it out, and understood that this woman was counting out almost the last coin she had in the world. Aria placed that penny back in her pocket. Some debts were not meant to be paid. By 2:55 p.m., her shift was supposed to end. She had earned $43 in tips. She had counted every bill carefully, had held each one like a small victory. Derek appeared at the counter. He was wearing a black shirt and silver rings. He moved like a man accustomed to taking what he wanted. He reached down and swept the entire tip jar into his pocket. The motion took approximately 4 seconds. "Manager's cut," he said. He grinned at her. His teeth were slightly yellowed, stained by coffee and cigarettes. "Problem?" Aria opened her mouth. She opened it to speak. She opened it to tell him that those tips were hers, that she had earned them by pouring coffee and wiping tables and existing in the background of other people's lives for 8 hours straight. She opened her mouth to tell him that she needed that money, that every single dollar moved her closer to the 65,000 or further away from it, that there was no in-between. But Derek leaned closer. She smelled the whiskey on his breath, the particular stale smell of alcohol that has been fermenting in a human body since 7:48 in the morning. "You got a problem, Aria?" His voice was low and even, like a blade wrapped in ice. "Because I got 3 applications on my desk from people who don't complain. 3. People who would work this shift for minimum wage and smile while they did it. You feel me? You feel what I'm saying?" She did feel what he was saying. She felt the weight of powerlessness. She felt the particular gravity of desperation. She felt the way the world was constructed to keep people like her on their knees. "No problem," she said. "That's what I thought," he said. At 4:36 p.m., just as she was untying her apron, Derek appeared at the door to the back storage room. Jennifer called in sick. Jennifer had the graveyard shift from 11:16 p.m. to 7:48 a.m. Now Aria had the graveyard shift. "You're covering," he said. Not asking. "Be back here at 10:45. Her phone had 2 missed calls from the hospital. She did not listen to the voicemails. At 9:33 p.m., Aria sat in the plastic chair beside Emma's hospital bed. Her daughter was awake now, coloring in a book with pictures of cartoon animals. The crayons were held in her small hands with the kind of concentration that only children could muster. There was something almost defiant in the way she colored, as if the act of creating color was an argument against the blue tint in her lips. "Mommy," Emma said without looking up from her picture, "when do I get to go home?" The question was so simple. It contained no awareness of the impossibility embedded within it. It contained only the small, pure hope of a 6-year-old girl who believed that her mother could fix anything, could solve any problem, could make the world work the way it was supposed to work. Aria reached down and stroked her daughter's hair. The hair was soft and dark and smelled like the cheap lavender shampoo that came in a plastic bottle from the dollar store. She held that softness in her fingers and tried not to cry. The tears would come. They always came. But not now. Not while Emma could see her. "Soon, baby," Aria said. "Real soon." "I miss my shoes," Emma said. She was still coloring, still concentrating on the yellow crayon making the sun brighter than the sun had any right to be. The pink ones. From before. Aria's chest tightened. The pink shoes. She kept them in her locker at Murphy's Diner, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag. Emma had been born in a women's shelter on 34th Street. The nurses had given her a temporary name and a hospital bracelet. Aria had slept on a cot 3 feet away, watching her daughter's chest rise and fall, wondering how she was supposed to keep this impossibly small human alive. When they left the shelter, when they finally had the first month's rent saved, when Aria had worked enough double shifts to afford real shoes for her daughter, she had bought Emma a pair of pink sneakers with Velcro straps instead of laces. Emma had worn them until they fell apart. Aria had kept them. She could not throw away the first real thing she had ever been able to give her daughter. "I know you do," Aria said. She kept stroking the hair. "Those shoes meant you were brave. You remember? You walked everywhere in those shoes. You were so brave." "I'm still brave," Emma said. She looked up from her coloring book. Her eyes were exactly like Aria's eyes, dark brown, almost black, with a particular depth that belonged to old souls in young bodies. "Right, Mommy? I'm still brave." "You're the bravest girl I know," Aria said. A nurse appeared in the doorway. The monitor beside Emma's bed had begun to beep in irregular patterns, and the nurse needed to check the readings, needed to adjust something, needed to perform one of the endless small tasks that kept her failing heart beating. Aria stepped out into the hallway. The fluorescent light seemed even harsher at night. At 10:15 p.m., she checked her bank account on her phone. $847.23. The hospital needed $65,000. The gap between these two numbers was so large that it felt like standing on one side of an ocean and watching the other side recede into impossible distance. She returned to the diner at 10:45 p.m. The rain had started again, falling in sheets that turned the neon signs into bleeding reflections on wet asphalt. The streets of Chicago were nearly empty. The few people walking moved quickly, hunched against the cold, their footsteps echoing off the wet pavement like a countdown. At exactly 11:11 p.m., Aria tied her apron around her waist and began the graveyard shift. The diner was nearly empty. A few insomniacs sat at the counter, nursing black coffee and the particular loneliness that belonged to people awake in the middle of the night. She poured coffee. She wiped tables. She existed in the fluorescent light and the hum of the dying neon signs. And outside, in the rain, in the darkness that pressed against the windows like something alive and hungry, something was moving toward her. Something that would arrive before the night was finished. Something that would change the direction of her life and the lives of everyone around her. But she did not know that yet. She only knew the weight of her tired feet and the sound of the rain and the particular ache in her chest that came from knowing that in 3 days, if she could not find $65,000, her daughter's surgical window would close forever. The rain fell harder. The clock on the wall moved toward midnight. And Aria Bennett, who had $2.34 to her name, poured another cup of coffee for a stranger and waited for something to happen that would tear the walls of her small, broken world completely apart. The rain hammered against the diner windows like fists demanding entry. At 3:22 in the morning, the kitchen exhaust fan hummed its dying song, and Aria Bennett carried the last bag of garbage toward the back door, her orthopedic shoes leaving wet prints on the checkered tile. The cold November air bit through her uniform when she stepped into the alley. The dumpster loomed in the darkness, a metal box that swallowed everything she threw away, just like this city swallowed people like her without a sound. That's when she heard the laughter. Derek's laughter. Sharp and cruel, the sound of a man enjoying someone else's suffering. She rounded the corner of the brick wall, and the scene froze her in place. Derek Collins stood with two men she'd never seen before, both wearing leather jackets that gleamed wet in the darkness. Between them, pressed against the alley wall, was an old man. 60 at least, maybe older, his clothes hanging from a frame worn thin by years on the street. His face was already bleeding. One of the men held his wrists pinned above his head. Derek raised a steel pipe. "Where's the wallet, old man?" Derek's voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who'd never faced a consequence in his life. "Where is it?" The homeless man trembled. His lips moved, but only a whisper came out. "I don't have anything. Please. I don't have anything." Aria should have walked away. The rational part of her mind, the part that knew Emma needed her, that losing this job meant losing everything, that she had $2.34 in her pocket and 3 days until a surgical window closed forever, that part screamed at her to turn around and go back inside. But she saw the terror in that old man's eyes, and it was her own face staring back at her from 5 years ago. The shelter. The cot. The social worker's voice saying, "There's no room for both of you." Emma crying in the dark. Aria's feet moved forward. "Derek, stop." Her voice cut through the rain like a blade through silk. All three men turned. The homeless man's eyes widened, not with hope but with fear, fear that this woman would make things worse for herself. Derek's face twisted into a smile that wasn't a smile at all. "Get back inside, Aria. This doesn't concern you." She stepped between them and the old man, arms spread wide, her frame impossibly small against theirs. Rain streamed down her face, mixed with sweat, cold seeping through the worn fabric of her uniform. Her hand shook violently. Her voice, when it came, barely wavered. "I said leave him alone." Derek laughed. The sound echoed off the brick walls, bouncing back at her with the weight of her own stupidity. "You're fired. Effective immediately. Now move or I'll move you." Aria did not move. Her feet stayed planted in the puddle that had formed around her broken shoes. Her body screamed at her to obey, to preserve this job, to protect Emma's future. But something deeper held her in place, the memory of every time someone had looked away while she suffered, every moment she'd begged silently for someone to just see her, just acknowledge that what was happening was wrong. "No," she said. The two associates stepped forward. Their shadows stretched across the wet pavement, distorting, growing larger, consuming the narrow alley. One of them cracked his knuckles. The other pulled something metallic from his jacket pocket, a knife, maybe, or brass knuckles. The sound of it made Aria's stomach drop. But what Aria did not see was the black Mercedes parked in the shadows near the loading dock, 50 feet away, rain drumming steadily on its roof like a heartbeat. Inside the climate-controlled silence of that car, Salvatore Marino sat perfectly still in his wheelchair, his hands folded precisely in his lap. At 41 years old, his face bore the scars of the car bombing that took his wife and unborn daughter 8 years ago, a burn mark running from his left eye to his jaw, a map of the moment his life ended and continued at the same time. His Lieutenant Tony sat in the driver's seat, one hand resting on his weapon, the other steady on the steering wheel. The engine was off. They had been watching the diner all night, tracking Derek's movements, gathering evidence of the money laundering, the trafficking, the countless crimes that hid behind the neon sign of Murphy's Diner. Salvatore had seen 300 acts of human cruelty from this parking lot. He had seen men beat other men. He had seen women dragged away. He had seen the city's darkness pour itself into every corner where there were no witnesses and no consequences. But he had never seen what he was seeing now. A woman, thin and worn and terrified, standing between predators and prey. A woman with nothing, he could see that from her shoes, her uniform, the way she stood like someone used to being invisible, putting her body between a stranger and violence. The same foolish bravery his wife Elena had possessed, the same refusal to look away from suffering even when looking away was the only smart choice. Salvatore raised one finger toward Tony. Wait. His eyes never left Aria's face. Derek grabbed her arm. His grip was meant to hurt. Aria gasped, stumbled forward, and fell hard into the puddle, her green apron soaking through water cold enough to shock her lungs. She scraped her palms on concrete embedded with broken glass and cigarette butts. The homeless man bolted. Derek stood over her, breathing hard, his face flushed with the exhilaration of power. You're done. Don't come back. Don't even try to get your final paycheck. You're finished. He turned to follow his associates, ready to chase down the old man, when a voice cut through the November rain. Touch her again and lose the hand. It was quiet. That was the terrifying part. Not a shout. Not a threat delivered with volume or venom. Just a statement of fact, delivered with the calm of someone describing physics. All three men froze. A wheelchair emerged from the shadows, its wheels silent on the wet pavement, moved by a man whose body had been broken but whose presence commanded the entire alley like he owned the air itself. Salvatore Marino. His suit was tailored Italian wool, worth more than Aria made in 4 months. His watch caught the reflected neon, a Patek Philippe that cost $40,000. Behind him, flanking him like shadows with guns, were Tony and Enzo, both 6'1", both with their hands inside their jackets, both with expressions that suggested they would break Derek's hand into individual components and mail them to him piece by piece. Derek's face went white. Not angry white. Not defensive white. The white of a man who had just realized he was standing at the edge of a cliff in the dark, and the dark was named Salvatore Marino. Everyone in Chicago knew that name. Drug dealers knew it. City councilmen knew it. Police commissioners knew it. It was the name whispered in the kitchens of Italian restaurants, the name that made men pour an extra drink and check that their doors were locked. Salvatore Marino was the reason that certain neighborhoods stayed quiet and orderly. He was the man you never spoke about loudly, and you definitely never touched anything that belonged to him. Derek backed away, stammering, his words collapsing into incoherence. I wasn't, she's just a... Go, Salvatore said. Derek went. His associates scattered like roaches when the light came on, their footsteps splashing through puddles, their breathing panicked, their bodies moving with the singular focus of escape. Within 5 seconds, the alley held only the sound of the rain and Aria's own gasping breath. Salvatore maneuvered his wheelchair beside her with practiced precision. The wheelchair was custom, the kind that cost more than a car, covered in leather and steel, its engineering a conversation between luxury and function. He looked down at her, still on the ground in the puddle, staring up at him with an expression somewhere between gratitude and terror. You hurt? His voice was low, controlled, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. She shook her head. Her lips moved but no sound came out. He nodded to Tony. Take her home. Make sure she's safe. Stay until she's inside and the door is locked. Then he turned his wheelchair toward the loading dock, toward the Mercedes waiting in the darkness, and disappeared back into the rain like a ghost with a physical body. Aria sat in the puddle for another minute, water seeping through her apron, her body shaking with adrenaline and cold and the delayed realization of what she'd just done. She had defied Derek Collins. She had stepped into violence. And she had been saved by a man whose face she couldn't quite remember, a man made of expensive suits and quiet menace and something else, something that looked almost like sadness. What she did not know was that Salvatore Marino had just made a decision that would reshape the entire underworld of Chicago. What she did not know was that Victoria Ashford was about to receive a phone call that would change everything. What she did not know was that 3 days was no longer her deadline. It was Derek Collins's. Tony's hand appeared in front of her, offering help. Aria took it, and he pulled her up with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a man his size. His black suit was immaculate despite the rain. His cologne was something expensive, cedar and leather and money. Come on, he said, his voice the voice of a man who was tired of the night and ready to get home. "Let's get you somewhere safe." As they walked toward the street where a black SUV waited with its engine running, Aria kept looking back at the spot where Salvatore's wheelchair had been, trying to understand what had just happened. She couldn't know that this moment, this small, defiant moment in a rain-soaked alley behind a broken diner, would cost Derek Collins everything. She couldn't know that it would destroy Victoria Ashford's entire empire. She couldn't know that it would save her daughter's life in ways that had nothing to do with money. But the rain knew. The rain fell heavier, as if the sky itself was weeping for what was about to unfold, for the reckoning that was already in motion, for the price that Derek would pay for raising his hand to a woman who stood between him and his conscience. The rain knew everything. The fluorescent lights of Chicago Memorial Hospital hummed like a machine counting down the final moments of Aria's old life. The surgical wing existed in a kind of sterile silence, the kind that swallowed sound and hope in equal measure. Emma lay in the pre-op bed, so impossibly small in the hospital gown that seemed designed for children twice her size, her tiny body overwhelmed by fabric the color of bleached bone. Her dark hair was braided back, exposing the sharp angles of her face, the exhaustion of a 7-year-old who had lived a decade of worry. Aria stood beside her daughter's bed, holding the small hand that had held hers through every impossible night. She forced her mouth into the shape of a smile, though her jaw trembled and her eyes burnt with tears she could not yet afford to shed. "Mommy, I'm scared," Emma whispered, her voice so thin it seemed like it might break if the wind blew too hard. "Me too, baby," Aria said, and she did not look away, did not flinch, did not let her daughter see the depth of the terror that had wrapped itself around her ribs like a cage. "Me too. But you're the bravest person I know. Braver than anyone. You're going to go into that room, and Dr. Martinez is going to fix your heart, and then you're going to wake up and everything is going to be different. Everything is going to be okay." Emma's small fingers gripped her mother's hand. "Don't leave." "I'm not going anywhere," Aria said, though she knew that in 90 seconds she would have to. In 90 seconds, nurses would come. In 90 seconds, she would be separated from her daughter by sterile doors and surgical masks and 6 hours of not knowing, not knowing, not knowing. The clock on the wall read 6:43 a.m. The surgery was scheduled for 7:15. Every minute that passed was a minute stolen from the night Aria had not slept, had not eaten, had not done anything but sit in the chair beside Emma's hospital bed and hold her while the child drifted in and out of medicated dreams. Dr. Martinez appeared in the doorway, a woman in her 50s with grey streaking her dark hair and eyes that had delivered both hope and devastation to hundreds of families. Behind her came the surgical team, 2 nurses, an anesthesiologist, a technician pushing a cart of instruments that looked like implements of torture to Aria's exhausted mind. "We're ready for Emma now," Dr. Martinez said gently. Aria kissed the top of her daughter's head. She pressed her lips to that soft spot where Emma's baby hair still grew, that place that smelled like the lavender shampoo the hospital provided, like fear and medicine and the scent of a child trying to be brave. "I love you so much," Aria whispered. "More than anything in the world. More than my own life. You understand? You are my whole world." Emma nodded, unable to speak. The nurses transferred her to the surgical gurney with practiced gentleness. They wheeled her toward the double doors that led to the operating rooms. Emma turned her head, trying to keep her eyes on her mother until the last possible second. Aria watched until the doors swung closed. Then she stood in the hallway, alone, and the silence that swallowed her was complete and absolute. She made her way to the surgical waiting room, a space designed to house the families of the dying, filled with uncomfortable chairs and stale coffee and magazines no one read. The walls were painted a color that was supposed to be calming but felt like drowning. She sat in a chair by the window, her hands folded in her lap, and she did not cry. Her tears had dried up somewhere on a Greyhound bus, somewhere in a shelter line, somewhere in a diner's back office when Derek Collins stole the last of her tips. At 6:58 a.m., the door opened. Salvatore Marino wheeled himself into the waiting room. His suit was perfectly pressed despite the early hour, charcoal gray, the fabric catching the light like water. His wheelchair was made of polished steel and leather, a machine that cost more than Aria's entire apartment. Behind him came Tony, massive and vigilant, and Enzo, younger, with eyes that watched everything and everyone. Salvatore wheeled himself to the chair beside Aria. He did not speak. He simply sat, and in the pocket of his suit jacket, he withdrew a handkerchief, white linen, monogrammed with letters too small for her to read, and placed it on the armrest between them. Aria stared straight ahead at the television mounted on the wall, where the morning news played soundlessly. She did not reach for the handkerchief. She did not acknowledge his presence. But she felt it like a weight, like an anchor in the terrible weightlessness of waiting. 1 hour passed. Then 2. Then 3. At 10:14 a.m., Dr. Martinez emerged through the surgical wing doors. She was still wearing her surgical mask, pulled down around her neck. Her eyes were clear. Her face was composed. Aria stood before the doctor could speak. The surgery was successful, Dr. Martinez said. The valve replacement went perfectly. Emma's heart is strong, stronger than it was yesterday. She'll need recovery time, careful monitoring for the next few weeks, but Emma is going to be fine. She's going to live a full life. Aria heard the words, but they did not seem real. They seemed like something spoken in a language she had forgotten how to understand. The doctor continued talking, instructions about post-operative care, discharge procedures, follow-up appointments, but Aria was already crying, her whole body breaking apart with the force of it, tears that came from deeper than bone, from the place where she had been holding her breath for 3 days, 3 years, a lifetime. She sank back into her chair and sobbed into her hands. Her shoulders shook. Her breath came in ragged gasps. She could not stop. She could not find the bottom of the relief, the gratitude, the impossible grace of her daughter living. Salvatore's wheelchair did not move. But his hand appeared, coming to rest briefly on her shoulder, a single moment of contact, nothing more. It was the gentlest thing a man like him had probably ever done. Tony and Enzo, standing near the door, exchanged that same look they had been exchanging for 3 days now, the look that said they had never seen their boss like this, and they did not understand it, and it frightened them more than any rival gang ever could. 2 days later, Emma slept peacefully in her hospital bed, the steady beep of the heart monitor a sound that no longer meant danger. The surgical scar on her chest was covered with bandages, a thin line that would fade with time, a reminder of the day her life was saved. Aria packed her few belongings into the suitcase Salvatore had sent her. 3 days of clothes. Emma's favorite stuffed animal, a rabbit with one ear torn. The photograph of Emma as a newborn, before anything was wrong, before her small defective heart began its countdown to catastrophe. The last thing she packed was the pair of tiny shoes. Emma's first pair, from when she was 6 months old and too small to walk. Aria had kept them through the shelter, through the second shelter, through the diner years and the double shifts and the nights when she was not sure she could survive until morning. Those shoes had been the only precious thing she owned, the only evidence that Emma had ever existed as anything other than a sick child waiting to die. She held them for a long moment before placing them carefully in the suitcase. Then she closed the lid. The apartment was empty now, the walls marked with lighter squares where posters had hung, where she had tried to make poverty look like home. It was 11:34 p.m. November rain hammered against the windows, the sound like 1,000 tiny fists demanding entry. Aria turned toward the door to leave. Derek Collins stood inside it. Behind him were 2 men she had never seen before. One held a gun with the casual confidence of someone who had held many guns. The other blocked the only exit, his body filling the space between her and freedom. Derek's face was twisted into something that barely resembled human. His eyes were red. His teeth were bared. His expensive shirt was half unbuttoned, revealing chest hair and rage and something that looked almost like desperation. His right hand was clenched into a fist. "You cost me everything," he said, and his voice was the voice of a man who had been screaming for 2 days. "Everything. Victoria wants you gone. She wants you erased. And I'm going to enjoy this." Aria backed away slowly. The suitcase was beside the bed. Her apartment was small, there was no space to run, nowhere to hide, nowhere to be except exactly where Derek wanted her to be. Where's your daughter? Derek stepped closer, each step deliberate. Still at the hospital? Still sleeping in that little bed? Maybe I'll visit her next. Maybe I'll explain to her that her mother got her killed instead of saving her. Something shifted in Aria's chest. Terror converted to fury in the space of a heartbeat. Her hands became fists. Her voice became steel. Touch her and I'll kill you myself, she said, and she meant it with an intensity that surprised even her. Derek laughed. The sound was obscene in the small apartment. He raised his hand to strike her, and time seemed to slow into that moment where his fist was coming and she was bracing herself and the rain was falling and everything was about to change again. The window exploded. Glass shattered inward, 1,000 diamonds of violence and noise. Tony crashed through the broken frame with his gun drawn, landing in a perfect crouch on the apartment's worn carpet. Behind him, Enzo followed, his weapon already trained on Derek and the two men. The men with Derek pulled their guns from their waistbands, a movement that took 2 seconds, maybe 3. Tony and Enzo fired first. 3 shots, precise and surgical, and both men collapsed to the floor with wounded legs, incapacitating but not fatal. The gun clattered away from the first man's outstretched hand. Derek turned and ran. He made it to the stairwell door, shouldering it open, taking the stairs 3 at a time. Tony was right behind him, moving like a man twice his age could not, driven by the particular fury that comes from being ordered to protect someone, from understanding the personal insult of this man's violence. Outside, the street was a tableau of controlled chaos. 12 men in black tactical gear surrounded the building, moving through the November rain like ghosts, cutting off every exit, every alleyway, every possible escape. They had weapons drawn. Their faces were composed. They were not police. They were something worse and something better than police. They were Salvatore's men, and they understood accountability in a way that law enforcement would never quite grasp. Derek burst into the alley behind his building, the same alley where 3 days ago he had stood with a gun in his hand and robbery in his heart, the same alley where Aria had thrown herself between him and a homeless man who had done nothing except exist in a place Derek believed he owned. Salvatore's wheelchair blocked the only path out. Salvatore sat in the rain without moving, without flinching, without acknowledging how the water soaked through his suit, how it ran down his face, how he looked less like a man and more like a monument to something dark and immutable. His eyes were the color of storm clouds just before lightning strikes. Derek skidded to a stop, his shoes slipping on wet asphalt. "Please," Derek said, and his voice broke into something unrecognizable. He dropped to his knees. "Mr. Marino, I didn't know she was under your protection, I swear. Victoria made me, she ordered it, I was just." "You stole from the helpless," Salvatore said, and his voice was like thunder rolling through a canyon, echoing off stone. "You threatened a mother trying to save her child. You put your hands on her. And you believed you would never answer for it." He nodded once to Tony. Tony spoke into the radio clipped to his shoulder, his voice low and professional. "We have Derek Collins in custody. We also have federal evidence of a trafficking operation. Records, locations, names, all of it. Where do you want us to send the package?" The FBI arrived in force within 8 minutes. Black SUVs with lettering on the sides. Agents in body armor. A perimeter established with the efficiency of people who had done this many times before. Derek Collins was lifted to his feet, his wrists bound behind his back, a black hood placed over his head. He was led toward the federal vehicle while news crews, already somehow there, already filming, already broadcasting, captured every moment. The sun was beginning to rise over Chicago's skyline. The rain was beginning to clear. Meanwhile, across the city, Victoria Ashford stood in her penthouse apartment on the 47th floor of Ashford Tower. She held her tablet, watching the news with a composure that did not crack, not when Derek's arrest was announced, not when the FBI warrant for her own arrest was read aloud, not when the reporter said her name and the word conspiracy in the same sentence. The tablet slipped from her hand and shattered against the marble floor. The penthouse door crashed open. Federal agents flooded in, their weapons drawn, their voices authoritative and impersonal. Victoria tried to run, an absurd gesture, as if the 47th floor was anywhere to run to, and her designer heels betrayed her on the polished marble. She stumbled. Agents caught her by the arms. "Victoria Ashford, you're under arrest for racketeering, money laundering, human trafficking, and conspiracy," the lead agent said. She screamed the entire way down. The lobby of Ashford Tower filled with employees, tenants, security personnel, all of them watching as the most powerful woman in Chicago was led through their carefully curated spaces in handcuffs, her face red, her makeup running, her designer suit already wrinkled from the officer's grip. "Do you know who I am?" she screamed. "I own half this city. I'll have your jobs. All of you will pay for this." The lead agent did not pause. "You don't own anything anymore, Ms. Ashford. Your assets are frozen, your account seized, your properties under federal investigation. You're done." Outside, the news crews were relentless. Cameras flashed like lightning. Victoria's face was captured from every angle as she was led into the federal vehicle, her power evaporating like rain on hot asphalt. The morning news cycles would replay the footage constantly. Socialite Victoria Ashford faces racketeering charges. Federal investigators uncover human trafficking network. By noon, her board members had resigned. By 2 p.m., her investors had fled. By evening, every Ashford hospitality property in the Midwest had closed its doors. Her empire, constructed over decades with careful manipulation and inherited money, collapsed in a single day like a building made of cards. Victoria sat in a federal holding cell wearing an orange jumpsuit, waiting for arraignment, no longer untouchable, no longer powerful, just another inmate staring at concrete walls. Tony brought Aria to Salvatore's estate. The car moved through Chicago's rain-soaked streets toward the North Shore, away from the diner, away from the apartment, away from every place that had tried to break her. The estate appeared through the darkness like something from another world, brick and stone and ivy, gardens even in November, windows that glowed like small fires against the night. Salvatore was waiting in the study, a room of dark wood and darker books, where the lamp on the desk cast everything in shades of amber. Aria sat in the chair across from him, her hands shaking, her mind unable to process the speed at which everything had changed. "It's over," Salvatore said simply. "They can't hurt you or Emma now. Derek is in federal custody. Victoria's empire is being dismantled. Your daughter is alive." Aria looked at him across the desk. She looked at this man in his expensive suit, this man who ruled an empire built on violence and loyalty, this man who had sat beside her in a hospital waiting room and said nothing and somehow said everything. "Why?" she asked, and her voice cracked. "Why did you destroy them? For me? For someone nobody? I don't understand." Salvatore was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the rain continued to fall. "Because some people deserve to fall," he said. "And because I'm tired of watching invisible people stay invisible while the powerful steal everything from them. You stood between a man with a gun and someone he didn't think mattered. So I stood between you and everything that wanted to destroy you." But what Aria did not know was that in her heart, something had shifted. Gratitude had transformed into something deeper, something she could not name, something that made her look at this man differently, that made her understand that strength was not measured in the violence you could command but in the gentleness you chose to show when no one was watching. The autumn wind carried the sound of Salvatore's wheelchair across the marble hallway at 4 in the morning, the soft hiss of rubber against stone the only noise in a house that had forgotten how to sleep. He found the letter on his desk before the sun rose, his name written in handwriting that trembled like prayer. His hand shook as he opened it, and with each word, something inside him that had been carefully locked away for 7 years began to crack open like ice under spring heat. Aria, his mind repeated, reading her confession of love like it was a blade through his chest. She was leaving. She was taking Emma and disappearing into the world because she believed she was a burden, a target, an anchor around his neck that would drag him and his daughter down. He sat in the darkness of his study and understood, finally, what it meant to love someone more than you loved yourself. By the time he wheeled toward the front entrance, the first light was breaking over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in shades of gray and rose. He moved with purpose now, his chair cutting through the hallway with the same controlled precision that had built his empire, destroyed his enemies, and, he understood now, prevented him from living. She was there, at the door, one small hand reaching for the handle, a child asleep against her shoulder. Emma's stuffed rabbit hung from her other arm. Aria's shoulders were rigid with the weight of goodbye. Salvatore's voice cut through the silence, raw and broken. "You really think I'd let you walk away without a fight?" Aria turned, and in her eyes he saw everything he had been searching for across 7 years of darkness. Her face crumpled when she saw him holding the letter. Tony and Enzo stood at a respectful distance, their faces carefully neutral, though both men were witnessing something they had never expected to see. In 15 years of loyal service, they had watched Salvatore build an empire with ice in his veins. They had never seen him vulnerable. He wheeled forward, closing the distance between them with the same determination he used to close distance on enemies. 3 feet from her, he stopped. "You think you're a target?" His voice broke on the words. "Aria, I've been a target my entire adult life. Everyone I've ever cared about has been in danger just by knowing me. That didn't stop me from loving Elena. It didn't stop me from wanting Sophia. And it will not stop me from—" He paused, searching for words that could contain what he felt. "You wrote that you're falling in love with me like it's a burden you're apologizing for. But what if I told you I've been in love with you since that night in the rain? When you stood there with your arms spread, protecting a stranger you'd never met, shaking like a leaf but refusing to move." Aria's breath came in short, sharp sounds, tears streaming down her face. "What if I told you," Salvatore continued, his voice steady now, "that Emma has brought light back into this house that's been dark for 7 years? What if I told you that I dismantled Sophia's nursery yesterday? I took down the crib, the mobile, the name painted in yellow. I turned it into Emma's playroom because I finally understand that holding on to the dead means I can't make room for the living. And I want to live, Aria. I want to live with you." She stood frozen, her daughter sleeping peacefully between them, unaware that her entire world was shifting on its axis. "Don't leave," Salvatore said. "Please. Stay. Not because you owe me. Not because you're grateful. Stay because you want to. Because I want you to. Because Emma deserves a home, and so do you, and maybe I deserve a second chance at a family." Aria set Emma down gently on the marble floor, where the child continued sleeping, her small body curled around her stuffed rabbit. Then Aria crossed the space between them and knelt in front of his wheelchair, taking his hands in hers. His hands were steady, strong, scarred from a lifetime of power, and they trembled as she held them. "I'm terrified," she whispered. Salvatore leaned forward, his forehead touching hers. "So am I. But I'd rather be terrified with you than safe and alone." When they kissed, it was soft and certain, a promise being made and accepted in the same breath. His hands moved to her hair, pulling her closer, and for the first time in 7 years, Salvatore Marino allowed himself to hope. Tony exchanged a look with Enzo that said everything. In all their years, they had never imagined seeing their boss like this, not as the ruthless ruler of an empire, but as a man who had found his way back to being human. Emma stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She looked at Aria and Salvatore, saw them close together, and smiled the sleepy smile of a child who understood, on some instinctive level, that everything had changed. "Does this mean we're staying?" she asked. Aria, laughing through her tears, pulled her daughter into her arms. "Yeah, baby. We're staying." 6 months later, spring transformed the estate into something from a dream. The gardens exploded with color, roses and peonies and lavender spreading across the grounds in riotous abundance. Emma, now stronger, her heart healed, ran through the grass with a golden retriever puppy, her laughter a sound that had never echoed through those halls before. Her cheeks were pink with health, her eyes bright with the kind of joy that only a child who has been given a second chance can possess. Aria stood on the terrace in a pale yellow sundress, watching her daughter play, unable to stop smiling. The woman who had once counted $2 as her entire fortune, who had stood in a diner at 3 in the morning with 3 days to save her child's life, was unrecognizable. Not because her circumstances had changed, though they had, but because hope had settled into her face like an old friend. Salvatore wheeled up beside her, taking her hand without a word. The gesture was simple, ordinary, everything. "Happy?" he asked. "I didn't know I was allowed to be this happy," Aria answered. 2 weeks later, they stood in the women's shelter where Aria had once lived, in the same room where she had slept on a cot with Emma curled against her side, counting the hours until eviction. The walls had been painted a soft blue. Sunlight streamed through windows that had been upgraded from broken glass to something that let the world in gently. Aria stood before a room full of women whose faces she recognized from her own darkest hours. Single mothers, all of them. Terrified, all of them. Invisible, all of them. "I stood in a diner with $2 in my pocket," Aria said, her voice carrying across the room. $2. And 3 days to save my daughter's life. I thought I was alone. I thought the world was only full of people like Derek Collins and Victoria Ashford, people who take and destroy. But then I learned something that changed everything. When you stand up for someone else, even when you have nothing, the right person is watching. And sometimes, real strength is not found in never falling but in always standing back up. You are not alone. You are not invisible. And your story is not over. The women applauded, some crying, some nodding like they understood the truth in her words because they lived it every single day. That night, Emma asleep upstairs, Aria and Salvatore sat in the study where 7 months ago he had told her that the people who hurt her were destroyed. The room smelled of leather and wood, of old books and newer hope. Rain pattered against the windows, a gentle sound, a healing sound. Salvatore opened a small box. Inside, a ring caught the light, simple, elegant, a single diamond that held no pretense, just promise. "I know it's only been 6 months," he said. "I know we're still learning each other. But I've wasted 7 years being afraid to live. I don't want to waste another day. Aria Bennett, will you marry me?" Her answer came immediately, her voice shaking with joy, with certainty, with the kind of love that rewrites destiny. "Yes." He slid the ring onto her finger and pulled her into his lap, kissing her like she was his entire world. Because she was. Because Emma was. Because a man who had lived in shadows had finally stepped into light. Real strength is not found in never falling but in always standing back up. If this story moved your heart, hit that like button right now. Share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances. Subscribe because tomorrow we have another story that will break your heart and put it back together. Drop a comment telling us, have you ever stood up for someone when it cost you everything? We read every single comment. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We wish you good health, joy, and days filled with peace. See you in the next story. Goodbye.